The NFL Draft is Ryan Poles' last big opportunity to answer some of the most important questions facing this Chicago Bears roster this offseason.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on X at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I've got a competitive side, and I'm a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on the classic Monopoly game. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now, free on the App Store or Google Play. On the show today, we look at the biggest questions the Chicago Bears can answer for themselves with this 2024 NFL Draft. We'll start with how exactly the Bears plan to get pressure on opposing quarterbacks. Who's going to be the players that rush the passer for this team? Is it going to be guys all purely under contract right now? Or is it going to be one or two or more other key additions on that defensive line? We'll also be able to answer what kind of support Caleb Williams is going to have. Is it just the weapons and linemen that he's got right now, or is there an opportunity here to add more of both to give Caleb Williams even more of a stronger supporting cast? And also some long-term questions that you could answer at safety, center, and wide receiver, as well as just more broadly philosophically, how the Bears keep this roster loaded up with young developing talent when you only start out with 4 draft picks. But the big question ahead of Ryan Poles in this draft, the big thing that we're going to get an answer to after the end of next weekend, really, is the pass rush, the defensive line. The draft is their last big opportunity to add difference-making players to that group. Of course, in free agency, you can always find veterans on the street to be backup players, to be end of the bench, end of the depth chart, fill-in guys. But as far as free agency goes right now, there's really not much in terms of starting caliber defensive tackles. And the main starting caliber defensive end still out there is Yannick Ngakoue, who was with the Bears last season and largely disappointed. And maybe there's still a path for a potential reunion there. But for the most part, if Ryan Poles is going to still add impact players to this defensive line, it will have to come from the NFL Draft. As we stand right now, your starting defensive line without any draft pick additions, Montez Sweat and DeMarcus Walker are your defensive ends. Jer'Zhan Dexter and Andrew Billings are your defensive tackles. I don't think that's the worst defensive line in football, but it's not top 20, in terms of top to bottom, starting defensive lineup there. Like, that is an underwhelming starting defensive line. You've got 2 players in that starting lineup right now that were not starters on this same team last year. 2 backups, 2 rotational players stepping into starting roles in Jer'Zhan Dexter and DeMarcus Walker. Certainly, we have optimism and hope for Jer'Zhan Dexter to grow and improve into an even bigger playmaker this year, in year 2, as opposed to him as a rookie. We should expect progress there. And even DeMarcus Walker, he's established as a veteran, but he had a stronger finish to last season than he started, perhaps aided by the addition of Montez Sweat. So there's an idea that perhaps Walker could be a little bit more productive next season as a starter with a full year next to Montez Sweat as opposed to only half a year. But it's not as though that Montez Sweat is going to, it's not as though DeMarcus Walker is going to all of a sudden become something he's not or hasn't been up to this point in his career. He's not going to turn into a 15-sack guy next year all of a sudden. He's just not going to take some astronomical leap midway through his NFL career. He is what he is at this stage of the process. The Bears need more on the defensive line, and the draft is the ability to do so. Whether that's taking a defensive end with the 9th overall pick, like Dallas Turner or Leatu Latu or Jared Verse, or whether that's taking a 3-technique pass rusher with the 9th overall pick, like Byron Murphy or Jer'Zhan Newton, Johnny Newton from Illinois, or a combination of those guys plus taking another defensive lineman in the 3rd round or in the 4th round, or trading down from the 9th overall pick, adding additional draft picks so you can address the defensive line in multiple ways. Like, the Bears need to add to the defensive line in some way, shape, or form, and preferably the earlier the pick and the higher quality of the player, the better for that group. But we know that Ryan Poles isn't just going to reach for whatever the big position of need is, and he's going to still try and stick to best player available on his draft board whenever possible. And so that's where it becomes a question of how this all ends up coming together. And to sort of take it back to the bigger picture question, how will the Bears get after the quarterback? How will the Bears rush the passer next season? If you don't add to the defensive line in the draft, you don't get an edge rusher in the 1st round or a defensive tackle. Maybe you get one in the 4th round, but that's it. That's the only defensive lineman you add. Does that mean then that Matt Eberflus this upcoming season has to rely more on blitzing again, as we saw like early last season when the pass rush, before they got Montez Sweat to upgrade the pass rush, he had to blitz more than we were used to seeing Matt Eberflus defenses send extra pass rushers. Like, they had to find other ways to get to the quarterback because the defensive line talent was insufficient. As it stands right now, I think the Bears' defensive line talent is better today than it was a year ago. I mean, when you got Sweat and Dexter in year 2 and Walker and all that stuff, sure, but still needs to be even better. And I think the ability to add a little bit more in the draft is what can make you feel like you don't have to be a more blitz heavy team to try and make up for that, the deficiencies you might still have on the defensive line. Like that's what it comes down to for me at the end of the day. Can you answer that question in the draft in some way, shape, or form? And maybe that answer is who you going to rush the quarterback with? The same guys we have right now. Maybe that's the answer, but I'd like to see that answer be something a little bit more. And how and where in the NFL draft that exactly comes from, I'm not going to be too picky about, but I'd like to see some investment at some point in some of these key spots on the defensive line. Ideally, an early defensive end and an early to mid defensive tackle would be how I would like to approach it in an ideal world. If those players are the best player available on your draft board, wherever that ends up being, if you trade down or trade up or whatever, like ideally that's what I'd like to do. But you can't draft every player in the 1st round, or you'd love to draft a receiver in the 1st round and a defensive end in the 1st round and a tackle in the 1st round and everything in the 1st round, and you can only put your resources towards one thing. And maybe Ryan Poles will feel like that early draft resource is better served at a position that will more directly affect Caleb Williams. And that's kind of the other big question here, is like how the Chicago Bears are going to support their quarterback, their number 1 overall pick rookie quarterback. And there's a few different ways they can go about that. And there's not necessarily like an urgency where like they went in with exactly what they have right now. I mean, you need to get a receiver in there, but we'll look at how the Bears can answer this question about what Caleb Williams supporting cast will actually specifically look like next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Monopoly Go. We've all been there, either as a player or a fan, when it's halftime. The scoreboard's not looking good. You're feeling low. You're not sure that you or your team are going to be able to pull out the win. But that's when you dig deep, lift your head up, and say to yourself, time to get back in the game. Pull off some bank heists and take as much of my friends' money as I possibly can. That's right, the smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone, anytime, and with tons of twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. Plus, you can play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards. You can make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball. And you can charge other players rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests. And you can work together in tournaments and get extra rewards and climb the public leaderboard. So, get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go. Now free on the App Store or Google Play. The Bears will be able to pretty clearly answer on draft day how Caleb Williams will be supported, not only for year one, but really for at least, the short-term future of him as the new Chicago Bears quarterback. As it stands right now, coming into a pretty good supporting cast. And we talked, was that earlier this week or was that late last week? I'm mixing my weeks together here. Earlier this week, we talked about the potential, the supporting cast that Caleb Williams is coming into and how Caleb's situation in Chicago is not only the best situation perhaps that a number one overall pick quarterback has ever come into, but it's among the best supporting cast and situations that any year one, day one starting rookie quarterback has gotten early in their careers. We went through some of the specific comparisons there between, guys that can argue and that are close with that, but we could really get a better sense of what that's going to look like knowing what they do with these draft picks. That they can still amplify that supporting cast that much more with the 9th pick, with a third pick, the 3rd round pick and a 4th round pick. And if they acquire other draft picks via trade downs in the draft, you feel like right now you're doing all right for yourself. You really feel like he's coming into something good when you've got a backfield of DeAndre Swift, Khalil Herbert, Roshan Johnson, Travis Homer, Kari Blasingame at fullback there. That's a pretty solid group that you don't feel like you really need to add much to at all. You've got young and experienced and productive and efficiency. And you got a little bit of everything in that backfield. He's good to go. You've got two top receivers, right? 2 receivers that finished in the top 12 in receiving yards last season, 2 Pro Bowl caliber number 1 receivers on their respective teams coming together to be Caleb Williams' top pass catchers. Obviously, a hole at the number 3 receiver spot that's currently going to be occupied by Tyler Scott that you'd like to upgrade from, but overall, certainly far from barren at the receiving core. Better set of wide receivers than either Justin Fields or Mitch Trubisky inherited when they came into the NFL as rookies. And then the offensive line is a little bit more of a cautiously optimistic. It's younger. It's players that are developing and that you hope continue to take steps forward, but we can't always count on that being the case, but you can hope that's going to be the case. And more often than not, young ascending players continue to ascend as they get older and more experienced. But, Braxton Jones, Tevin Jenkins, Nate Davis, and Darnell Wright back from last season from left to right there. Maybe they upgrade from Braxton Jones, but if not, he's been getting better year 1 to year 2 and now entering year 3. We love what Tevin Jenkins does when he actually is able to stay healthy, but presumably, hopefully, he could stay healthy for a full season and be excellent. Right guard Nate Davis, underwhelming a little bit this past season, but dealing with some off the field stuff early on, some family issues or whatever that ended up being for him. And, that was just kind of clunky all around. And then Darnell Wright as a rookie last season, you're hoping he can keep growing and playing even better this past season. The main question mark is still at center. Will it be Ryan Bates? Will it be Coleman Shelton? Will the Bears go out and add another center in the NFL draft here? Or even potentially a left tackle upgrade over Braxton Jones with that 9th overall pick. And we'll get a much better sense after draft day what exactly Caleb Williams' supporting cast is going to look like. If Ryan Poles goes to the draft and gets a receiver like Rome Odunze with the 9th overall pick, and then, in the 3rd round gets a center, or maybe in the 4th round, a Bo Limmer from Arkansas, or I'm struggling to remember some of the other centers in that range. There's a hyphenated last name who's totally escaping me right now, but there's a couple of mid-round centers we've talked about before on the podcast that, could end up competing to start even with the 2 veterans that are already under contract there. You've got a few different options for what this might look like. Van Pran from Georgia is the name, the hyphenated name I've been trying to think of. Cedric Van Pran from Georgia in the 3rd round, or Bo Limmer from Arkansas in the 4th round. There's guys in that range, or maybe Tanner Bortolini from Wisconsin later on in the draft, or the Penn State center whose name escapes me. There's some different options there. Or maybe, you get a left tackle at the 9th overall pick like Joe Alt or Olu Fashanu, and then in the 3rd round you get a wide receiver like Jermaine Burton, or maybe one of the USC receivers like Brendan Rice or Taj Washington later in the draft, and all of a sudden, okay, you've gotten Caleb revamped O-line and a little bit more at wide receiver, and all of a sudden, offensively, maybe there aren't any major holes you're looking at, or any holes at all that you're looking at. And you can say, you know what, maybe the defensive line that we talked about before is still going to have some holes, but at least everything that's directly around Caleb Williams is as good as we possibly could have made it. That there's an answer for every question that you might have for that group on that side of the ball, and prioritizing Caleb's development by investing there is more important, like to have those players that will directly affect how Caleb develops this season than the defense that will have some impact. But like drafting a 9th overall pick edge rusher doesn't give Caleb Williams more time to throw in the pocket, right? Doesn't give Caleb Williams more yards after the catch or make his receivers get that much more open, right? Obviously, like defense plays better. Bears have, better on the scoreboard. Caleb's not as behind as much. Can play with more of a lead. He can play better. Like there is an influence. Like having a good defense absolutely helps a young quarterback develop and play better. But like an individual offensive lineman or wide receiver is going to have more impact on Caleb Williams than a pass rusher, than a defensive line somewhere on that side of the ball. I suppose there's still an opportunity for the Bears to go out in free agency and add another, lesser wide receiver there, but I don't know that the wide receiver they go out and get in free agency at this point, after the draft, it'll be late April at that point. I don't know that they're going to find like an impact playmaker number 3 type receiver out there. Like I know you can hold on to ideas of somebody like Odell Beckham Jr., but I don't think he's going to come be the number 3 in Chicago. But it's not that there's no good free agents out there, but the free agents that are going to come to the Bears and be that number 3, I don't know, Michael Gallup. It's like Allen Robinson's out there, Hunter Renfro's still out there. I guess, but not like huge impact. Wow, Bears landed this stud number 3 receiver to add to the group with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. I'm not necessarily so sure. Like same thing on the offensive line. Like at this point, the Bears are not going to find a starting offensive lineman outside of the NFL draft. You could get more depth at tackle or guard or even center, but like you're not going to find a guy who comes in and goes, boom, here's your new starting left tackle. Here's your new starting center. Like your 5 starters are more or less on the roster right now, unless you take one with the 9th overall pick. Or I guess somebody could compete later on in the draft. But for the most part, it's draft or bust at the offensive line position. And I suppose we can't remove tight end from the conversation here. I didn't mention them in the rundown of players, but with Kmet and Gerald Everett, you feel really good about what the Bears have. They don't need to add anything at tight end, but you could certainly find a role for Brock Bowers if the Bears really believed in him being a difference maker for this offense. And I like some of the other later round or mid-round sleeper tight ends in this draft, like Ben Sinnott from Kansas State, friend of the show, Clay Harbor, is a really big fan of. I really like Theo Johnson from Penn State as well, as a guy that I think can be an impact playmaker and develop as a good number 2 early on and, give you more and more down the line. So there's a real opportunity here for the Bears to really cement what that supporting cast looks like for Caleb Williams. But it feels like with only 4 draft picks right now, it's going to be really hard without making a trade for Ryan Poles to thoroughly address the pass rush that we talked about at the beginning and also thoroughly address the supporting cast for Caleb that we just talked about. Like 4 total picks, one of which is going to go to Caleb. So really 3 picks to address wide receiver, offensive line, defensive line thoroughly and effectively is not enough as it stands. So I'm curious about one of the other questions the Bears can answer here is like, can you keep a roster well-stocked with young talent with only 4 picks in the NFL draft? Ryan Poles, that question may be no, and he answers it by trading down and adding more picks to keep his roster well-stocked, but it could be saying yes and finding a way to make all 3 of those picks go really far. We'll take a look at what that might look like and how the Bears also may want to address some of the more long-term plans on their roster for players that that won't be starters in year 1, but we'll need to answer some questions about who's going to be the players at some positions, in 2025 and 2026 next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Yahoo Finance. Just like you listen to Locked On Bears for all of the best information on the Chicago Bears all in one place, Yahoo Finance is here to do that for your financial future. You've done a lot of the hard work. You've saved, you've researched, you invested all that you can, but now you can take those investments to the next level by using what every great financial great uses with Yahoo Finance. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data you need all in one place. Instead of just whatever your broker or your brokerage account provides you as the recommendations, like Yahoo Finance pulls everything from everyone. So you're not just getting one source like you are from your current brokerage. Like Yahoo Finance is the number 1 finance destination. producing a holistic look at the financial news cycle with breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. It's great because you can securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401ks and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors, and it's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. With only 4 picks in this draft, it's going to be difficult for Ryan Poles to address everything. And to me, it's like less about addressing the biggest needs per se, but also just about keeping the back end of this roster well stocked with another crop of young players on rookie contracts. Right? When we talk about the foundation of a roster, the teams that you see end up being very successful and like consistently successful are the teams that, I mean, obviously, like drafting good players is the secret formula is acquiring good players and not missing your draft picks. Yeah, but like everyone is trying to do that. But more specifically, like teams that you draft players and you develop those players, knowing that every player you draft and develop, you're not going to be able to keep and pay a big contract, right? You draft a guy in the 3rd or the 4th round, and by the end of his rookie contract, he's great and he's demanding a top of the market value contract. Like you can only hand out so many top of the market value contracts. And so eventually, if you do this right and you draft really well, you're going to have to let good players go, whether you trade them or get compensatory picks or whatever. Like eventually you can't afford, if you keep adding good players, you can't afford to pay all of them big money. So you're going to have to let good players go and replace them with other players that still need to be pretty good. But you can't afford to keep paying players big, so you need to replace them with good players who are cheap. And the most effective way to keep your roster full of good players who are cheap is via draft picks, right? The rookie wage scale leaves their contracts and artificially holds them down so they can't make as much money as they might be worth on an open market every single year. Like that's the advantage here. That's why, like, of course, drafting good players is important because it's a way to, you just need more good players, but it's not just getting good players. It's getting good players while they're cheap, right? You could sign free agents till you're blue in the face, but they're not going to be cheap. And it's hard to sign good free agents that are cheap. Usually you get what you pay for, or at least like it's hard to get more than what you pay for. A lot of times you get less than what you paid for, but it's hard to get more than what you paid for in free agency. But it's a lot easier to get more than what you're paying for in the NFL draft. And that's about like putting guys across your roster on rookie contracts, right? That's where I say it's not purely about can Ryan Poles fill all his team needs in the draft. Like, yeah, you'd like to do that too, but it's also about saying, okay, do I have young developing players essentially at every position across the board that in the future will get better and can become a replacement for a potentially more expensive player on my team that I might not be able to keep all of my more expensive players. Like, you know, as Tevin Jenkins comes in the next year, you know, he's going to cost a lot of money. Or you're already paying Cole Kmet a lot of money. DJ Moore and Keenan Allen cost a lot of money. DeAndre Swift costs a decent amount of money. Montez Sweat costs a lot of money. Like, eventually, the players on the rookie contracts now, like Jalen Johnson, come up, and you have to pay them big, and you can only pay so many of those guys. So, you know, when the next player a year or two from now comes up on the rookie contract, I'm trying to like eyeball real quick like a good example of that. I mean, we're a couple years from Kyler Gordon coming up on the end of his rookie contract. Are the Bears in a position, like if Kyler Gordon has a big season, are the Bears in a position to pay 2 cornerbacks big money? Or is that a spot where they say, sorry, we're already paying Jalen Johnson, we got to let Kyler Gordon go, and do you have Terrell Smith or another young cornerback developing behind him that can step in and fill his shoes that isn't going to be as good as Kyler Gordon was, but is still going to be cheap and is going to be still good enough, right? That's what you need to build out by consistently drafting good players with a consistently wide haul of picks. Like usually if you can try and do a 7-player draft class every year, like, you know, over the course, that takes, you know, after 5 draft classes of 7, that's 35 players. That's a majority of your roster you can draft over the course of 5 years. So every year, if you keep stacking in 5, 6, 7, 8 players from the draft, you keep having cheap, inexpensive backups that are developing and getting better, as opposed to veterans you sign off the street that not only cost a little bit more, but also aren't really getting better. And so I'm curious if Ryan Poles is comfortable with his ability, like truly comfortable. He said he's comfortable with only 4 picks, and that if they don't acquire any more picks, he's okay with that. He says that. And that because he's not going to back himself into a leverage thing and say no. Because if he goes in an interview and says, hey, are you comfortable with 4 picks? And he says, absolutely not. We desperately want to trade for more draft picks. That takes away his leverage and negotiations with the team. So, of course, he's always going to say, yes, we're happy with where we are. We don't have to do anything. We have leverage, et cetera, et cetera. But does he truly feel like he can address the need for just young talent in general across this roster, with only 4 draft picks? And I find it hard to believe that Ryan Poles goes through any draft without making any trades. Now, does that mean I'm not going to guarantee he trades down from 9? No. But he's either going to trade up or down from one of these 3 picks after the number 1 overall pick. Maybe it's only down a few spots in the 4th round. He picks up a 6th round pick and the Bears finish with a 5-man draft class. Like, it might be something as simple as that, and that doesn't all of a sudden solve the problem here. But Ryan Poles is going to answer a question here about how he tries to keep this roster stacked. And in a similar vein, you talk about drafting, young players to develop at some of these positions. One of the other questions we're going to get an answer to is do you have a long-term plan at free safety? Do you have a long-term plan at center? Do you have a long-term plan at wide receiver? If they don't draft a center, your plan is Ryan Bates on 1-year deal, Coleman Shelton on a 1-year deal, or Doug Kramer. I think he's on a 1-year deal after being cut and brought back and et cetera. You don't really have a long-term plan at center right now. Free safety. You got Kevin Byard on a 2-year deal that's really more like a 1-year deal with a team option. You've got Elijah Hicks, but he's not really the long-term starting plan there. So if you draft a safety, there's your long-term plan at safety. If you don't draft a safety, you don't have a long-term plan there. And same thing at wide receiver when it comes to Keenan Allen in this number 3 spot. Is Tyler Scott the long-term plan at wide receiver? I don't think so. It would be nice if he developed into a starting caliber player, and I'm certainly not ruling that out by any means. But I'm not counting on him to all of a sudden become a 1,000-yard receiver next year or the year after that. He could be a good quality contributor, but is that the long-term plan at wide receiver? Or if you draft Rome Odunze at 9, you've got the long-term plan at wide receiver. That's part of this process, right? What are the long-term plans at some of these positions? Will Ryan Poles be able to adjust those plans, or will those plans be left as, well, we'll figure that out later? I mean, that can be the plan is, well, we'll figure out center. Well, who's going to be the starting center in 2025? We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Who's going to be the starting center next year? Or starting safety next year? We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Who's going to replace Keenan Allen? Well, we still have time to get a replacement. When it comes to these long-term plans and these bottom of the roster or, backup set number 2 string players, you don't have to answer that right now. It would be nice to know, to have everything set. Your center's developing on the bench, your safety's developing on the bench, your wide receiver's developing in that rotation, and you've got starting defensive end in the draft and starting defensive tackle in the draft and maybe a left tackle. You know what I mean? It would be great to have 8 picks all in the top 50 of this draft to fill all your needs and get all the great players and feel like, wow, this roster's set. That's not the case. And so how Ryan Poles prioritizes this thing is really the $1 million question that's what we're all fascinated to tune in for. How is Ryan Poles going to prioritize all these different moving parts and also prioritize then the value of picking at 9 versus the value of potentially trading down and the value of having more picks versus 1 pick in the top 10? That's the exciting stuff. That's the stuff that we're breaking down and previewing and getting ready for and going through all the different scenarios right here on the Locked On Bears podcast to make sure that you're ready for draft day and draft weekend. So I hope that you'll hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We've got a double dip for you today. In the podcast feed, you'll see we added part of the Locked On NFL mock draft special, where all 32 of our NFL hosts got together and did a mock draft with trades all together. And we got just the episode where we've got the Bears pick at 9 in the podcast feed. I guess the spoiler alert, I didn't trade it. I tried to trade it, but I couldn't get an offer to trade it. But I won't tell you who I picked. You got to go listen to find out. I tried to trade it at 9. I was unable to do so, so I had to stay there and make a pick that I feel very good about. But, listen for yourself. It's available now in the Locked On Bears podcast feed. I assume that clip will go up on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, but that's above my pay grade. But certainly that aired in the Locked On Sports 24 hours live stream on YouTube or Amazon Fire TV. It's in the Locked On NFL and Locked On NFL Draft channels as well. It was a huge production. I mean, I highly encourage you to go check it out. It's a bunch of analysis from all of our draft experts, plus hosts moving things along, and then all of our individual hosts breaking down our individual picks. It's a really cool thing. You should go check it out for any fan of the NFL draft and any fan who wants to see what the Chicago Bears ended up coming away with in this first-round mock draft. So go check that out. Coming back tomorrow for another full episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity for you to bear down.